Origins, homosexual reaction. This is why did the Anglo-Japanese alliance fail? Well, general history matters. In the early 20th century, Britain and Japan were the best of friends. Okay, I didn't know that. They hated their neighbors, loved boats, and wanted to take other people's countries. Despite this common ground, their alliance dissolved. Oh yeah, that's a good point, right? Both are islands, right? Both rely on naval power because they're islands, so there's many similarities. I guess because of that, geopolitics, it also makes sense to be a friends in that way. So yeah. So in 20th century, okay, so could have been many things, I don't know, like world wars, I guess. Well, let's see. I love history matters. I love how the topics they explain that I guess most people don't even think about, right? I didn't know Anglo-Japanese had, great friendship that don't fall apart. So yeah, that's what it did.
In the early 20th century, Britain and Japan had a lot in common. They were both island nations which had poor relations with their closest neighbours. They were both naval imperial powers who preferred to fight their wars in other people's countries. And importantly, they both hated Russia. None of these things changed over the course of the early 20th century, yet in 1921, Britain and Japan's alliance fell apart.
Yeah, I guess being an island is really important in that way. It kind of applies to USA as well, because even though it's not an island, north of it's Canada, south of it's mostly like Southern American countries. That's not much of a threat to them. I'm pretty sure Real Life Lore made a video about how geographically, USA is great because of this. So for them, they might as well be on an island. So most of the wars happens overseas, right? So yeah.
Raises the question, why? Why did the Anglo-Japanese alliance fail? So for context, back in the late 19th century, Britain was, well, suspicious of basically every other major power. Germany was a rising threat, Russia was eyeing up India and Central Asia, the USA was asserting itself across the Americas, and France was France. Britain was enjoying a period of self-imposed geopolitical isolation, but these outside threats could no longer be ignored. As such, it was time for an ally. There was always trusty Portugal, but this wasn't the 18th century anymore and it no longer held the same authority. Britain at the time didn't want to side with any of its European rivals because of the risk of getting dragged into a major conflict.
I don't think they trusted Portugal. It was more like, Portugal hated Spain somewhat, so in that way, but I don't know.
It was too great. And the United States was also happily isolated at this time and was mostly seen as a threat to Britain's Caribbean territories. Thus another ally was necessary and only Japan fit the bill. Britain and Japan both had concerns about Russian expansion into what they saw as their rightful spheres of influence. Both were worried about the growth of the US Navy and both wanted to force China to buy their stuff. As such, the two formed the Anglo-Japanese alliance in 1902. This stated that Japan recognised Britain's dominion in India and in return Britain recognised Japan's interests in Korea and China, but it notably forbid Japan from annexing them. And importantly, both agreed to support each other in the event of a war with two or more powers. For Britain, this treaty was seen as more of a statement of intent that it was no longer isolated. In Japan, the treaty was a big deal, because Japanese politicians saw it as Britain agreeing to help them fight against Russia, and also it was an equal treaty unlike all of the previous ones it had to sign. So, as you'll know, Japan and Russia went to war in 1904 and Britain didn't get involved. Now, Japan had hoped that Britain would stay neutral as a counter to France, whom Russia had an alliance with. France couldn't help because fighting Japan would mean that Britain would be dragged into the conflict, which France didn't want. Russia was soon unvictorious and Japan's status as a great power.
I guess that's one of the other things, right? Yeah, Japan, I think, signed treaty with English because of this. They knew, France at they probably knew what a political sphere was at that time, and they knew that if they get friendship with England, France is not going to attack Japan because that means they're going to have to fight another war with England, which they didn't want. And if Japan attacks Russia, France has to involve, but now they can't. So I guess that was one of the main reasons, if any other, right? I mean, I never thought of it like that, but yeah, Japan and Britain has many things in common like this, right? Like their struggle and friction with the US, right? Japan in Pacific Ocean, and obviously Britain also. So both had friction with US, both had Russia because it was touching them. That's how big Russia is. It touches all the way to east and in Britain apparently, in that close proximity to Britain. So they have issues there as well, and even the alliances were made in a way that it just fit perfectly. But that kind of shows like why World War I happened. Everybody just fit their alliances just right that it create major power imbalances, right? You should never have that kind of a political friendship that literally puts you one group or the other, because that means that those groups are now going to fight at world stage.
And and as a result, Britain was keen to renew the alliance, but this time Japan had more leverage. As such, to maintain the alliance, Britain agreed that Korea was doomed to annexation. And later on, when both Austria-Hungary and Germany declared war on Britain, Japan was obliged to help, which it did, seizing a bunch of German territory in Asia, which Britain was grateful for. So why did the alliance collapse despite it being so beneficial to both? Well, the cracks started to show at the Versailles Conference. As part of the proposed peace, Japan wanted a racial equality clause in the treaty. Britain refused since many nations within its empire, particularly South Africa and Australia, very much didn't want it. This upset the Japanese because nobody wants an ally that refuses to accept you as being as human as they are. The treaty wasn't renewed in 1921 because of the...
We were like, yeah, see, everything's great. Yeah, we're living in paradise. Everything's going swimmingly. But how about you acknowledge that we are equal? And the Britain like, equal? Taking out the pipe.
The deep divisions within the British Empire about foreign policy. The British government wanted to renew the alliance as a safeguard against Soviet, French or American aggression, whereas Canada and Australia saw Japan as an untrustworthy ally and a threat to their trade. There was also a push by the United States to get Britain to ditch the alliance for the potential of closer relations with Washington. And when the Washington Naval Treaty was concluded, the potential of French or American expansion in the region was deemed unlikely. And so, renewing the alliance wouldn't provide much benefit to Britain, which is why it chose to let it die, and in 1923 both nations acknowledged its end, thereby forcing Japan to find new friends. I hope you enjoyed this episode, with a special thanks to my patrons, James Bizanet, Kelly Moneymaker,
Yup, so... Alright, imagine that. Like, how would a World War II played out if Anglo-Japanese alliance didn't fail? Like, I mean, I guess Hitler would have screwed much earlier. Or maybe Hitler would have chosen a bit caution because he didn't have one element that he had initially in World War II. Like, he couldn't rely on Japanese to cause all the commotions. So maybe he would have been more careful and in turn more, I don't know, problematic long term. Because in World War II, only thing you can really, aim at, like, Hitler was way too fast, way too quick and aggressive, and that was his kind of downfall. But I don't know. But yeah, this alternative history thing is really interesting, right? Every time you can, just certain elements you remove it and all the butterfly effect is fucking awesome. But yeah, Anglo-Japanese, the same reason they had the alliance, obviously over time, those, like relationship with US and things, obviously when they change, why keep an alliance? So this is one of the most fragile alliance there can be. So it kind of makes sense, like some interest met, so you had an alliance. That's it. Yeah, that was doomed to fail. You need more stronger alliance, like, more money related, right? Trading related, more profit related. If your alliance is like that, you're going to see the same thing in the future. But some interest change all the time. So yeah. Alright, well, that was why did the Anglo-Japanese alliance fail. The channel History Matters. If you like my reaction, don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you next time.